Hello, and welcome to another edition of Senior Soundings. I'm your host, Gerry LePage, and we're delighted to have you on board for this latest episode. And also delighted to have with me my guest, Kate Wells, archivist of the Providence Public Library. And Kate, thank you for coming over. We're delighted to have you on. I know that there are numerous archival collections at the library, but the focus for this particular episode is going to be the LGBTQ Community Archive, the queer history of Rhode Island, if I may say so. So tell us more, Kate, about what is the LGBTQ plus Community Archive. How was it created? What do you do to manage it and curate it? And how can people visit it or otherwise make use?
Sure. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.
I'm the Curator of Rhode Island Collections at Providence Public Library's Special Collections Department. And as you mentioned, we collect lots of things about the state of Rhode Island and its history. And one of the areas that we've been really focused on in the past, 5 or 6 years, since 2019, has been the Rhode Island LGBTQ plus Community Archive Project. And that came about because several years, sort of from about 2016 onwards, we were getting researchers coming in who were really interested in LGBTQ history, and we weren't sure what we had. So we were looking in our collections to determine what would researchers be interested in, and we didn't find as much as we thought ought to be there. And then we looked at other libraries and archives in the state to say, where else can we send researchers? And we realized different libraries like URI or Brown had some materials, but not a lot. And so sort of what we quickly established was there was nobody who was intentionally collecting queer history for the state to provide public access to it. And we thought as a public library, that felt like a really good match. We have experience working with other community archives projects. We ran the COVID-19 project with Rhode Island Historical Society and other smaller arts organizations and cultural groups. So we had some experience and we thought this was a really good match. I should say I started this project with a colleague of mine, Angela DeVeglia, who has remained with our project even though she's no longer at Providence Public Library. But we work to set up advisory boards. So one of the things that makes this particular collection a community archive, especially, not just an archive, is that we have an advisory group of about 10 to 12 individuals, all who identify under the LGBTQIA umbrella in some way, some of whom have experience working with historical materials and so have an understanding of kind of the role that heritage and history can play in terms of documenting community. And other people have been lifelong Rhode Islanders or really active in the LGBTQ community in Rhode Island and just have a passion for it. So we are excited about anybody who wants to get involved. And that advisory group helps us sort of set the direction. So that's a little different than the way normally traditional archives work, but it has meant that we have a lot of community buy-in. And so one of the things we found since, we got kicked off in 2019, then COVID hit, so we had a long pause of being able to actually take physical collections in. But since we've reopened later in 2020, we are getting materials donated all the time. And so sometimes they are just one item. It could be, for example, somebody cleaned out a desk drawer and they popped in the library and they said, I found this program to it was from the Gay Nutcracker, which was I think a holiday performance that was performed at Brown in the 90s, several years running. And they said, we found this. I didn't want to throw it away. I thought you might be interested. So sometimes it's just one single thing that people drop off. And other times it's an organization which says, I have years worth of records that document the work we've been doing for social advocacy or public health or things like that, and would you like them? So it really runs the gamut, and we have researchers coming in very regularly, even though it's a relatively small growing collection. So yeah, it's been exciting.
Yeah, I guess so. So while you were paused due to COVID, were you able to review all of these materials and decide what you were going to keep, or?
Yeah, most of what we did in 2020 was a lot of sort of the groundwork of setting up the organizational structure of what this would look like. So traditionally with archives, people tend to think of us as the storage place for old things, which is true, but also we're really interested in sort of, traditionally things will come in, and maybe it's 100 years old or older. The person who created the item is no longer here. We can't ask them anything about it. They can't give us any additional context. So this kind of approach really is focused on making inroads with community members to sort of engage them in that process. So while people are still alive, so maybe that's contributing oral history and doing recordings. Sometimes that's just being able to say, this is a flyer and this is why this event was important. So
yes.
yeah, so during the COVID period, we spent a lot of time sort of laying that groundwork. What would that look like? What was our focus for outreach? Building relationships with people.
Right.
So our first collections came in, I think the very first collection we took in right as we reopened after COVID was AIDS Project Rhode Island. And we had spent a good amount of time with folks there sort of saying like, what historic materials did they have, talking about issues around privacy because that's a public health organization, what's appropriate to make available to the public researcher and what isn't. So lots of sort of behind the scenes work during COVID.
I see.
Yeah.
I see. Now you mentioned this is a community archive, and how does that differ from a traditional archive?
Yeah. So, like I was saying, the traditional archives is, we tend to get materials that are sort of what we would consider long inactive. So that could mean that it's an organization that disbanded years ago. Nobody's using those materials. Or it could be family photograph albums that are 100 years old or several generations removed. I think from a community archive standpoint, we're really looking at contemporary record collecting. And it's with that idea that we are not the final arbiter, myself as the curator or other library staff, we're not the final arbiter of what's important to be historical. So with a community archive, it's really materials collected by the people who are represented in the stuff. And those people are helping to determine this is what's important to us to save. So really it's taking myself or library staff, archivists out of the sort of gatekeeper role and giving that control over to community members. And community archives, they're all over the place. It's a term that maybe people aren't as familiar with, but for example, if a church or a synagogue has its own records of its own membership, that's a community archive, right? Community archives don't ever have to become public. They can, there's a lot of reasons why organizations or people want to keep those things within their own space. And that's totally great. Our job is to, with this particular project, is to say, let's collect things intentionally so that that history is available to other people. And I think there's sort of queer history, and documenting queer history has its sort of own set of challenges. And so we wanted to be really, really thoughtful with that collection in terms of who's represented. LGBTQIA is a really big umbrella. There's lots of different stories under that one umbrella. And so we want to get as many voices to the table as possible.
Right. And you mentioned that it is something that you have to consider in a unique context. So why do you think the queer history in Rhode Island and really lots of places has been historically hidden? How is that changing? How do those changes affect the way you approach building the collection?
Yeah. So one of the things that's really, I think, challenging for the history of many marginalized groups, so that could be, any range of groups of people who, for whatever reason, were not considered sort of like where historians were really interested in documenting. So we have a lot of information generally about what we would consider like traditional or heterosexual, normalized, upper class white Americans. We don't have as many collections or materials related to people of color or Native people in the state or disabled or people who are socioeconomically disadvantaged. And one big group is also people who are LGBTQ. And a big reason for the queer population or queer history being kind of very underdocumented is that for many, many years, up until very recently, it was criminalized to be homosexual.
Right.
And so there were very good reasons to protect your privacy and make sure that your history wasn't sort of accessible. And so really what we're looking at for marginalized history is how do systems of power, and so that could be religion, that could be laws, that could be other kinds of socioeconomic influences around whose history is visible. So Rhode Island, for folks who may not know the history, beginning in 1647, Rhode Island colonial law had made homosexuality a capital crime.
Wow.
And it remained punishable by death for 237 years.
Oh my God.
So we were actually, especially in the Northeast, the strictest in terms of punishing homosexual behavior. And I think it was for a long time third most strict in the entire country. That capital punishment wasn't reduced until 1884 when it became a prison sentence of up to 12 years.
My goodness.
Right, it's really strict. And that stayed in place up until 1995. So sometimes it wasn't prosecuted. It could be, it was what colloquially became known as the sodomy laws, but the sort of discrimination laws for LGBTQ people were in place till 1995. That meant you could be evicted from your home, you could be denied financial access to banking, you could lose your parental rights, you could be fired with cause. So there was a lot of real danger for people to have their sexual or gender identity made public.
Right.
And so really brave for people who did come out, but there was a real reason to sort of keep that private. And so when somebody's actual survival is at risk, there's not a lot that gets left behind in terms of paper records. Right. So you find things, and this is certainly not unique to Rhode Island, but internationally, LGBTQIA history has been underdocumented because people destroyed their personal correspondence or their photograph albums, or organizational records were really kept under wraps.
I see.
So there's kind of that piece. There's also this huge cultural shift that has happened in the later half of the 20th century around social context, language, the terminology people use. That all goes to making that history really hard to find. So for a really long time, for example, lesbian history was sort of buried under the term women's history or feminist history. So while there was a lot of lesbians in the Equal Rights Amendment movement in the late 20th century, they weren't all lesbians. So, sort of parsing that out is a little challenging. But also, the terminology that we would use now in terms for gender and sexual identity just didn't exist, prior to the early 20th century. So trying to uncover those stories where we know the people existed, they just may not have defined themselves in the same way that we do now, makes it much more challenging. So one example of that, our modern sensibilities might say would be a Rhode Island history of a lesbian couple for Gertrude Johnson and Mary Wales, who started Johnson & Wales, what is now the university. Nowadays we might look at their lives and say, they were possibly a lesbian couple. So they met in college, they started a business together, they lived in the same residence their entire adult lives, neither of them ever married. The home they retired to in Warwick, Rhode Island had, as I understood it, one bedroom, so likely they shared a bedroom. We would probably say there's a good likelihood that they were in a romantic relationship, but there's no way to prove that. Right. They didn't call themselves lesbians, they've left no private correspondence or records that would indicate the nature of their relationship. So that's a kind of a great example of what I kind of call history with an asterisk, right? So I want to let researchers know, well, this is somebody you might want to look into, but we don't know. We don't have anything historically that would prove that one way or the other. The other thing I think about LGBTQ history that's important to note is, well, all history really, but especially with this, is that not everybody's story should be made public. That's totally appropriate, right? Like we all have things in our family histories that we think, oh, I don't know if I want everyone in the world to know XYZ about me.
Right.
And that is entirely appropriate. We're not asking people to donate materials that feel uncomfortable for them to make public. And that has come up, actually, we talk a lot about, especially materials that reflect people who are long since passed. What's our role and responsibility in, for example, outing somebody who didn't define themselves as gay or lesbian or transgendered in their lifetime, but we might look them that way now. So we spend a lot of time actually on our advisory board talking about that. And we can talk about a couple, like at least one example that I have brought with us. Yeah.
Well, just one other thing, you know, I can't get past the irony, excuse me, that, you know, Rhode Island, a state that was founded on the principle of religious freedom, was so strict in implementing these anti-gay laws for such a long time. So that's very ironic.
Yeah.
But, well, you mentioned you have some examples and some things, and I think you also brought a couple of, a few photographs.
Yeah.
That I'm sure there's some interesting stories about those. So take it away.
Okay, so one of my favorite people that we've been collecting materials about is early 20th century female impersonator who went by the name of Frances Renaud. So I brought a couple of pictures related to their life or their life as a performer. So in the first picture, you'll see Antonio Oriema, which is his given name, in costume as Frances Renaud. And so Antonio Oriema arrived in Providence with his family. He was about 8 years old in about 1900. His father worked in the jewelry district downtown Providence, and the family lived on Smith Hill, right behind, not far from where the State House is. And they, you know, were sort of a very typical immigrant family coming from Italy at the time. And by what we have found out is that by 1911, Antonio, or Tony, was selling newspapers in downtown Providence, and as part of his sort of way to convince people to buy papers from him and not another newsboy, was that he would sing on the sidewalk. He was apparently discovered with a wonderful soprano voice and convinced to start performing in vaudeville theaters in Providence. And pretty much immediately, as far as we can tell, began performing as a female impersonator, which maybe now we would consider drag. That the female impersonation sort of phrase is a bit outdated, but that is what they used then. And he began performing under his last name, Oriema, in Providence, changed it to Frances Renaud, moved to New York when he became a little bit more of a star, and then became really internationally renowned by the end of his career. So the bulk of his work on stage was from about 1915 until the 1940s. And he was the sort of byline in the advertising for his performances was the slave to fashion. One of the things that was really remarkable about him was the costume wardrobe was incredible. And in the first image you'll see, you can see one of this very, very extravagant gown. They advertised that his wardrobe was valued at what was about $50,000, which in today's money is about 1.1 million.
Amazing.
And yeah, so one of the things he was notable for in the Depression was that, you know, the full performance was 15 cents, but if you couldn't afford that, you could just see the wardrobe on display in the theater foyer for 5 cents instead. And so his story is really interesting because you know, in the materials we've collected, in the second image, you can see a picture of Antonio not in his performance wardrobe, just in a regular suit. But one of the things that was sort of notable is in the materials we've gathered about Antonio Oriema, he refers to himself both as Tony and Francis. So, and nowadays, in the way we think about gender identity, we have no idea if he would have considered himself a man who performed in drag, or potentially somebody who would have wanted to live as a woman, but given the societal constraints couldn't. There are some recordings that in several states he was arrested for wearing female clothing outside of the theater. So I think that happened in Atlanta, Georgia, at least. So we don't really have any evidence of his internal thoughts. We haven't collected any correspondence or things like that. But we can tell from the way he signed, for example, stage portraits and things like that. Sometimes it was Tony, sometimes it was Francis, sometimes it was Tony/Francis. So obviously there was a way in which he considered himself to have sort of this dual identity. And also it's a really interesting story. I mean, I think just the idea, people tend to think of drag as, maybe because of the popularity of TV shows right now, as a newer phenomenon. It's not. It's hundreds of years old. There's easy documentation to sort of corroborate that has been in place for a really long time. He's a really interesting character, I think partly because he started in Rhode Island and went on to this sort of international acclaim. But we certainly don't just collect old stuff. One of the things we're really interested in is sort of conveying to people that the things they have sitting in their desk drawers or in a storage box in their attic is really valuable. And so a couple of other things that I decided to focus on for today. One is a flyer. It's called the Congress of People with Gay Concerns. And it's, when you think of a flyer, right, we all see them sort of tacked up at the library on the bulletin board or on a, somewhere out in the community. They're really ephemeral. They often don't get saved, so that makes them actually really valuable for archives. But this is a flyer that advertises the very first Pride Parade that happened in Rhode Island in 1976. And so we're coming up soon in a couple of years on the 50th anniversary.
Yes.
But the story of how that came to be is kind of interesting. So the flyer notes it's the Congress of People with Gay Concerns. And that was a small group of people mostly associated with the Metropolitan Community Church in Providence, which was a very early church in terms of accepting and really cultivating LGBTQ membership. And they had applied to be part of the Rhode Island's bicentennial celebrations across the state. So 1976, right?
Yes.
And the Bicentennial Commission denied their request. And the rationale given was that homosexual behavior was illegal,
right,
and they did not want to they didn't think it was appropriate to celebrate illegal activity in the bicentennial parade. So the Congress of People with Gay Concerns joined with the ACLU to bring a lawsuit against the Bicentennial Commission. Judge Ray Patine at the Rhode Island Federal Court oversaw the case, and in his decision notes makes a remark about the fact that the irony that people were doing illegal acts and being denied participation in the bicentennial when the American Revolution was in and of itself a set of illegal acts, right? So he sort of said that rationale doesn't really stand up in court. So the Congress of People with Gay Concerns did win the court case. The bicentennial activities were required to allow them space, but they, for a variety of reasons, chose to have their own event instead of participating in sort of a more centralized statewide event. And so they held the first Pride Parade on June 26, 1976. So to have this flyer is really unusual because as far as we know, there is only one set of film footage of that event at the Rhode Island Historical Society. We haven't found any photographs. So this flyer is sort of one of the very few actual physical items. There's a number of people who were there and have been able to record their experiences. But so that's like a really exciting find.
That sure is.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then the third one I brought was just a photograph of Easton's Beach. And that is from a collection that came in from a Newporter, Lionel Piers, who was the owner of Castaways, which was previously called David's, and was the longest running and last open gay bar in Newport. So I brought that because thinking folks on the East Bay might really have memories of this space on Easton's Beach. And this is a great example of like some of what we're collecting is really just people's personal photographs, very personal items. It doesn't have to be historic, right? Like it's just, this is a memory, but it depicts a part of Easton's Beach, which was known as the gay section of the beach. And so it's a picture from the 1980s. It's, you know, sort of just a bunch of people at the beach. In and of itself, if you didn't happen to know that this was the gay section of Easton's Beach, it wouldn't feel that important. But for people who can then look back and say, oh, I know who that person is. I remember them. And they were, you know, this is how we all knew each other. And also that sort of sense of community that there was this space in a larger public arena for gay people to be able to be together. So sort of you get a wide variety. I'll give you a couple of samples of some really sort of what feels like historic content, you know, in the sort of typical way, and other things that are just personal memories. So
fascinating, fascinating. Well, Kate, we have a couple of minutes left. Maybe you could sum up by telling our viewers how people can contribute materials to the collection and otherwise get involved with the library to manage this collection.
Sure.
So go ahead.
So we love to have people visit in person. You can come to our special collections reading room at Providence Public Library. That's what people often think of as the downtown branch. You can come visit us in person. We love to have you by appointment if possible, because that just ensures we have materials ready for you. But if you happen to be in the area and you swing by and the door's open, just come in. You can email me directly, and I think the email address will be up on the screen, to make an appointment. And we've also got a few materials available online. So if you can't make it down to Providence, you can go to our digital repository, which is provlibdigital.org. And we've got the Kim Deacon collection. Kim owned Kings and Queens Bar in Woonsocket from the late 70s through early 2000s. So we have materials related to that bar. And then we've got a number of oral histories that we've collected with the Queer Stories Project. That is, I think there's about 35 oral histories with LGBTQ people across the state that are online as well. That digital repository includes almost 17,000 objects. Most of them are related to Rhode Island history, so certainly not just LGBTQ history. So visit the site anyway. But you can find some queer materials online. And then what we're really hoping to do is spread the word that we are interested in people donating materials. So if you are cleaning out your home and you find some things that literally, like I was saying earlier, it could be the one flyer to an event, or a small group of postcards or photographs, things like that, mementos, small artifacts. You know, people forget there's things like, you know, political buttons, or matchbooks from places that you don't find those as much anymore. But, you know, those are the kinds of things we would love people to donate.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Kate, thank you. We're pretty much out of time. I would like to observe that Francis Renaud is the French word for fox. And in that respect, Tony was a foxy lady, clearly. So with that, we thank you for coming along and joining us on another edition of Senior Soundings. Thank you, Kate, for being such an interesting guest. And we'll see you all again next time on Senior Soundings.